Millionaire finds his ex-girlfriend at a restaurant with three teenagers identical to him. He's shocked. Jonathan walked into the upscale restaurant, his usual air of confidence barely masking the emptiness he felt. He had it all: money, status, influence, but still, a quiet loneliness gnawed at him. He scanned the room, noticing a familiar face at the far corner. Elin, his ex-girlfriend, the woman he had abandoned years ago, thinking he could escape the responsibilities of fatherhood. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. He hadn't seen her in over a decade, but she hadn't changed. Same strong, determined look in her eyes. She wasn't alone, though. At the table with her sat three teenagers, three boys, all identical in appearance. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at them. They looked just like him. Impossible. He hadn't known. He didn't know. Elin's calm expression didn't give him any answers. She didn't need to say anything. The resemblance between the boys and him was enough. It was as if the room tilted slightly, and Jonathan could feel the weight of the moment settle over him like a cloud. He had children. 3. They were his. Jonathan. Elin's voice was steady, but there was no trace of warmth, only a quiet strength that mirrored the years of resilience she'd built. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He couldn't form a coherent thought. Instead, his eyes darted to the boys, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Sit down," Elin said, gesturing to an empty chair across from her. "We need to talk." Jonathan did as she asked, his mind racing. The air around him seemed to thicken, each second stretching longer than the last. His pulse quickened as the realization hit him fully. These were his sons, 3 teenagers he never knew existed. How had it happened? Why didn't he know? The boys didn't speak, but Jonathan could feel their eyes on him. Judgment, curiosity, or perhaps both. He didn't know what to say, how to begin. The silence between them was deafening. "You didn't know, did you?" Elin's voice broke through his thoughts, and Jonathan looked at her, his eyes wide. "No, I didn't," he managed to say, still grappling with the shock. He could feel the words on the edge of his tongue, but they didn't feel real. He had always been so focused on his career, on his empire, that he never even thought about the consequences of his actions. He had abandoned her, and now he was face to face with the evidence of his neglect. 3 children, his children, who were strangers to him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice strained. "I tried," Elin replied, her gaze unwavering. "But you were never interested. You were too busy building your empire. You never cared to know what happened after you left." Jonathan felt the sting of her words, but it wasn't anger he saw in her eyes. It was something deeper, something that made him realize how much he had failed. He looked at the boys again, but they remained silent, their expressions unreadable. "I never wanted your money," Elin continued. "I didn't need your help. I needed you to be there. But you were never there." Jonathan's chest tightened. He had always prided himself on being able to control everything, on being the one who provided, who made the decisions. But here, in front of him, was a reality he couldn't control, a family he had abandoned. And now, his children were confronting him with the truth. The truth that he had never been there, and now it was too late to go back and change that. The silence in the room felt suffocating, but there was no way to undo the damage. He couldn't erase the years he had missed, and he couldn't change the past. But now, sitting across from the woman he once loved and the children he never knew, Jonathan realized that he had to face the consequences of his actions. He had to figure out how to repair the unrepairable. Jonathan sat frozen, his mind reeling from Elin's words. He had spent his life building an empire, surrounding himself with wealth and power, all in the hope that it would fill the emptiness inside him. But now, sitting at this table, facing the reality of his failure as a father, none of it seemed worth a thing. The boys were still silent, their eyes locked on him, but Jonathan couldn't read them. He wasn't sure whether they hated him, were indifferent, or were just as lost as he was in the situation. But what he did know was that they had every right to feel what they felt. He hadn't been there for them. He had chosen everything else over them. Elin broke the silence again, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to say anything, Jonathan," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "You're here, and that's all that matters." but I won't let you pretend that you can just walk in and fix things with a few words." Jonathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wasn't there to make excuses. There was no excuse for what he had done, no explanation that could make up for the years he had lost. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. He hadn't been there for his sons. He hadn't seen them grow, hadn't been there for their first steps, their first words. He hadn't been there when they needed a father the most. And now, looking at them, he realized how much he had failed them. I don't know what to say," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. I didn't know. I didn't know about any of this. I know," Elin interrupted gently. "I know you didn't know, but you also didn't care to know. You didn't even try. You were too busy with your life, your work. You had everything except the one thing that mattered." Jonathan felt his stomach twist at her words. They stung, but they were the truth. He had been selfish, so wrapped up in his own success that he had never thought about the life Elin had built without him. She had done it all alone, raised their children with strength and resilience, teaching them values he had failed to pass on. "You were right to do it alone," Jonathan said quietly, his voice breaking. "I failed you, Elin. I failed them." Elin didn't respond right away. Her eyes softened, but there was no pity in them, only an understanding that Jonathan was beginning to grasp. She had carried the weight of parenthood by herself, but she had never let the boys see her break. She had always been the strong one, never showing them the vulnerability that Jonathan now realized had been there all along. "You did what you had to do," Jonathan said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and regret. "You didn't need me. You didn't ask for my help. You just did it." Elin nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I didn't want your money, Jonathan," she said quietly. "I didn't want anything from you. What I needed was you to be here, to show up, to be their father." Jonathan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He had thought he could buy his way out of the consequences of his actions, that his success could make up for the absence. But he was wrong. The truth was simple. His wealth couldn't fill the gap he had left in his children's lives. Only he could do that, and he hadn't. "I can't change the past," Jonathan whispered, more to himself than to Elin. "But I want to try. I don't know if it's too late, but I want to be here now. I want to be their father." Elin studied him for a long moment, and Jonathan could see the conflict in her eyes. She had spent so many years alone, protecting her children from the truth, from the pain of having an absent father. She had built a life without him, and now, even though she could see his sincerity, she wasn't sure if it was enough to make up for everything he had missed. "You'll have to show them," Elin said finally, her voice calm but resolute. "It won't be easy, and they won't just forgive you because you want to fix it now. They've been through too much, but if you really want to be here, you have to prove it. One day at a time." Jonathan nodded. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't even know if he could ever earn their trust. But one thing was clear. He had to try. He couldn't keep running from the consequences of his past. He glanced at the boys, who had been quiet throughout the conversation. They were still watching him, their faces unreadable. But Jonathan knew that they were absorbing everything. They were learning about who he was now, not who he had been. "I'm here now," Jonathan said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but he knew they were true. He wasn't going to walk away again. Not from them. Not from Elin. He had failed them before, but he wasn't going to make that mistake again. Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about what Elin had said. Every word she spoke echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You didn't need me," she had told him. "You did it all on your own." Those words, spoken with quiet strength, shattered his sense of control. He had always thought that providing for them financially would somehow make up for his absence. But now, sitting in this restaurant, with his children staring at him, he saw how wrong he had been. The silence that lingered after Elin's words was almost suffocating. Jonathan wasn't sure how to break it. He wasn't even sure if he could. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless. All his achievements, all his wealth, none of it mattered in the face of the loss he had caused. He had missed years of his children's lives, and there was no way to get those years back. He glanced at the boys again. They were still silent, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. Raphael, the oldest, was the first to speak, his voice quiet but firm. "So, what now?" Raphael asked, his tone guarded. "Are you just going to pretend that everything's fine now? That you can come back and everything will be okay?" Jonathan's heart sank. He knew the anger in Raphael's voice was justified. He had abandoned them, and now they were all looking to him for something he wasn't sure he could give them. "No," Jonathan said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm not pretending. I don't expect everything to be fine, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I've done too much damage for that." He paused, trying to find the words that would convey what he felt, but nothing seemed enough. "But I want to try. I want to be here for you. I know I can't change the past, but I can try to be a father to you now." Raphael's eyes softened, just a little, but there was still doubt in them. "Try," he echoed. "What does that even mean? You've been gone for our entire lives. How do you just try?" Jonathan felt the weight of Raphael's words like a physical blow. He wanted to explain, to make them understand that he had been wrong, but he didn't know how. The truth was that there was no easy answer. He had made so many mistakes, and now, as he sat across from these three young men, his sons, he was realizing just how deeply he had failed them. "I don't know," Jonathan admitted, his voice soft. "I don't know how to make up for what I've done. I don't know if I can, but I'm here now, and I'll keep showing up. I'll be here for you, even if it takes a lifetime for you to trust me again." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't as suffocating as before. Raphael looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Jonathan held his breath, waiting for a response. But it was Lucas, the youngest, who spoke next. "You don't get it, do you?" Lucas said, his voice low and uncertain. "You think you could just come back and everything will magically be fine. But we've been living without you. We've had to grow up without a father. And now you want to just walk in and be a part of our lives?" Jonathan's chest tightened. The pain in Lucas's voice was unmistakable. He was right. Jonathan had never been there for them, never had to face the consequences of his absence. And now, he was trying to fit himself into a life that had moved on without him. "I know it's not that simple," Jonathan said quietly. "I know I can't just walk in and expect everything to be okay. I don't expect you to welcome me with open arms. But I'm asking for a chance to prove myself to you. I'm asking for the chance to be your father, even if it takes time." The words felt heavy, but as they hung in the air, Jonathan could see a flicker of something in Lucas's eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a small sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. Elin watched them both closely, her face a mix of exhaustion and quiet hope. She had never told the boys about Jonathan's absence in a way that would make them hate him. She had always protected them from that reality, even though she had every right to be angry at him. She had raised them alone, never once speaking ill of Jonathan, never giving them a reason to despise him, even when he had deserved it. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away," Jonathan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I've ruined so much, but I want to be here. I'm not leaving again." For the first time since they had arrived, the boys seemed to soften a little. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a shift. Jonathan could see it in the way they looked at him, just a little less cold, just a little more open. He wasn't sure what that meant or where it would lead, but it was something, and that was enough for now. The days that followed were filled with tension. Jonathan had expected it to be hard, but nothing could prepare him for the emotional weight of being around his sons. Every moment was a reminder of what he had lost, and each interaction felt like a step on a path he wasn't sure he could walk. Despite his promises to change, he felt as though he was constantly falling short. He spent more time with the boys, trying to bridge the gap, but each attempt was met with silence or cold responses. Raphael, the oldest, remained distant, while Lucas, the quiet one, seemed to watch him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Gabriel, the middle child, was unpredictable, sometimes open, sometimes closed off. Jonathan had always been a man who thrived on control. But here, in the presence of his children, he had no control, no power, no answers, and it terrified him. He realized, with painful clarity, that his past efforts to fix everything with money and status had been futile. The one thing his children needed most, his presence, he had withheld for years. One evening, after dinner, Jonathan found himself sitting alone in the living room. He stared at his phone, but he wasn't really looking at it. His thoughts were consumed with Ellen's words from that first night they met at the restaurant. "I did it alone," she had said. "You were never there." It felt like a gut punch every time he thought about it. The weight of her sacrifice, the strength it took to raise 3 children on her own, while he had been busy building a life that now seemed empty. Jonathan had heard of single mothers before, but he had never understood it until now. What Ellen had done, how she had carried the responsibility of parenthood alone, was something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He had always assumed that being a father was about providing, about offering the material things. But Ellen had shown him what it truly meant to be a parent. It wasn't just about providing a roof over their heads or paying for their college education. It was about showing up. It was about being there when they needed you, even when you didn't have the answers. As Jonathan sat there, lost in his thoughts, the door to the living room creaked open. It was Lucas. He stood there for a moment, hesitating, as if unsure of what to do next. Jonathan had tried to reach out to him many times, but Lucas had always been reluctant to engage. "Hey," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You want to talk?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. Jonathan wasn't sure if Lucas was angry, sad, or just confused. But he didn't push. He had learned that much over the past few days. Sometimes the best thing to do was to be patient. Finally, Lucas looked up. "Why didn't you care?" His voice was quiet, but full of raw emotion. "Why didn't you care about us?" The question hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. It was the question he had been dreading, and yet it was the question he needed to hear, because it was the truth. He had never cared enough. Not enough to show up, not enough to make the hard decisions. He had buried himself in his work, in his success, thinking it would fill the emptiness inside him. But it hadn't. Not until now. "I didn't care," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "I was selfish. I was too focused on myself to see what I was losing. I can't change that. I can't change the years I missed. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere, Lucas." Lucas looked at him for a long moment, his eyes hard to read. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan sitting there, feeling more helpless than ever. Jonathan let out a long, slow breath, his mind swirling with a mixture of guilt and determination. He didn't know how to fix things with Lucas or with any of them, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up. He was here now, and he would keep showing up every day. Even if it took a lifetime for his children to accept him back into their lives, he would prove to them that he was worthy of being their father. The silence in the house was deafening, but Jonathan had become accustomed to it. He had expected the coldness, the distance from his children, but there were moments when it felt like he was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He had tried, in every way he knew how, to reconnect with them, but the walls remained firmly in place. As he sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly pushing his breakfast around, his mind wandered back to Ellen's words from days earlier. She had done it all alone. She had raised 3 children, not just with the strength of a mother, but with the resilience of a warrior. And Jonathan, he had been too blind, too self-absorbed to see the weight of it all. He had been too focused on his own world, his own success, to understand what Ellen had endured. Ellen had never asked for help. She had never once relied on Jonathan's wealth or status, even when things got tough. She hadn't needed him to provide. She had done it all on her own, and that's what haunted Jonathan the most. She had never needed him. She had managed without him, without ever once complaining, without ever letting their children see her struggle. The pride she had in doing it all on her own was something Jonathan couldn't quite grasp. He had failed her. He had failed them all. And yet, Ellen never spoke ill of him. She never tried to turn their children against him. Despite the anger, the bitterness, she had kept the memory of their father intact, allowing their children to form their own opinions without any influence from her. That was something Jonathan could never fully understand. How could she have been so strong, so selfless, when he had been nothing but a ghost in their lives? How could she raise their sons, teaching them values and principles, when he had walked away without a second thought? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, But when he opened it, he saw Elin standing there, holding a small box in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a tiredness, a weariness that hadn't been there before. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, handing him the box. Jonathan took the box from her, confused. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling as he lifted the contents. Inside was a framed picture of the three boys, his sons, at a school event. They were standing side by side, smiling, their arms draped around each other. It was a simple photo, nothing extravagant, but to Jonathan, it felt like the most precious thing he had ever seen. "They've grown so much," Elin said quietly, her voice softer now. "And they've done it all without you. They've grown into strong, independent young men. And you've missed so much." Jonathan swallowed hard, the weight of her words hitting him like a wave. He hadn't been there for any of it. Not the late nights, not the victories, not the small moments that made up their childhoods. And now he was here trying to rebuild something that he had let slip away. "I can't change that," Jonathan said hoarsely, his throat tight. "I can't undo the time I lost with them. But I'll keep trying, Elin. I'll keep trying." Elin's gaze softened, though her face remained calm. "I know you will," she said. "But it's not about what you say. It's about what you do. It's about being present. It's about showing them that you're here and that you're not going anywhere." Jonathan nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He knew what she was saying was true. Words were meaningless now. His actions were the only thing that could prove he was sincere. Elin paused for a moment before speaking again. "They don't need you to be perfect, Jonathan. They just need you to be here. And that's what you've failed at all these years. But you can fix that. You can still be the father they deserve." The sincerity in her voice struck him hard, and Jonathan felt a deep ache in his chest. He had always prided himself on being a provider, on taking care of things, but he had never understood that being a father meant more than providing money or security. It meant being there, being present, showing up, even when it was hard. "I don't know if they'll ever forgive me," Jonathan said quietly. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Elin didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a moment, watching him, as if deciding whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded. "I hope you mean that," she said softly, "because they've already been through enough. Don't make them wait any longer." Jonathan watched her turn and walk away, her figure disappearing into the distance. He stood there for a long time, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It wasn't just about fixing things with the boys. It was about understanding the depth of what Elin had done, how much he had sacrificed, and how much he had missed. But as he stood there, holding the photo of his children, Jonathan felt a small flicker of hope. He wasn't sure how to make things right, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up on them. Not this time. Jonathan's world felt smaller now, like the walls of his own house were closing in on him. And with every passing day, the weight of the years he had lost felt heavier. He was beginning to understand the depth of the mistake he had made, but that knowledge didn't change the past. What it did, however, was drive him to make things right. Even if it took a lifetime, he had to try. After Elin left, Jonathan stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the framed photo in his hands. The faces of his children, his sons, smiling back at him, their arms around each other, were an image of something he should have been part of. They were growing up without him. He had missed birthdays, graduations, and all the quiet, everyday moments that made up a family. Now, it was too late to turn back time, and no amount of wealth or influence could fix that. The doorbell rang, breaking him out of his thoughts. He opened it to find Lucas standing on the doorstep, his arms crossed, a look of uncertainty in his eyes. "Hey," Jonathan said, trying to mask the surprise in his voice. "What's up?" Lucas shifted on his feet, clearly hesitant. There was a long silence before he spoke. I don't know if I should be here," Lucas said, his voice low. "But I guess we need to talk." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. This was the first real moment of interaction they had had since that night at the restaurant. He knew he had to tread carefully, but there was no going back now. "You're here, Lucas," Jonathan said gently, stepping aside to let him in. "And I'm listening." They sat down in the living room, the tension between them palpable. Lucas, like the other two boys, hadn't spoken much in the last few days, and Jonathan understood why. It was too soon. He had been a stranger in their lives for too long. But the fact that Lucas was here, that he was willing to talk, was a step in the right direction. "I'm not really sure what to say," Lucas admitted, running a hand through his hair. "You've been gone for as long as I can remember. And now you just want to walk in and pretend you're our dad again?" Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight of Lucas's words landing heavily on his chest. There was so much hurt in his voice, so much pain. He had no answers to give Lucas, no magic words to make everything right. But he could try. That was the only thing he could do. "I don't want to pretend, Lucas," Jonathan said softly. "I don't want to pretend I wasn't there, because I wasn't. But I'm here now, and I know I can't just fix things overnight. But I want to try. I want to be part of your life. Even if that means starting from nothing." Lucas looked at him for a long moment, his expression hard to read. "I don't know if I can believe you," he said quietly. "You weren't there for us when we needed you. And I don't know if I can just forget that." Jonathan's heart sank at the words. They weren't easy to hear, but they were the truth. He had abandoned them when they needed him the most, and now he was asking them to trust him again. He couldn't expect it to happen right away, but he had to keep showing up. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Lucas," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I don't even know if I can earn that trust, but I will never stop trying. I'll keep showing up for you, for all of you, no matter how long it takes." There was silence again, but this time, it wasn't as heavy as before. Lucas seemed to soften a little, but the walls were still there, still high. Jonathan wasn't sure if they would ever come down, but he knew he had to keep trying. No matter how long it took, no matter how much effort it took. "I just don't get it," Lucas said, his voice still unsure. "Why now? Why do you care now?" Jonathan swallowed hard, the question echoing in his mind. Why now? Why had he waited until it was too late? He had no answer for that, but he could give Lucas one thing: his presence, his dedication to being there, no matter how hard it was. "I can't change the past," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "I can't undo what I've done. But I can promise you this: I will never walk away again. I will be here, for as long as you'll let me." Lucas didn't respond immediately, but Jonathan could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that, despite everything, Jonathan was here. And that was something, even if it wasn't enough. "I'll try," Lucas said quietly, his voice uncertain. "But I can't promise anything." Jonathan nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him, though it was tempered with the knowledge that the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. That was enough. The next few days felt like a slow crawl for Jonathan. He spent more time with his sons, trying to find some semblance of connection with each of them, but it wasn't easy. Raphael, still guarded and cynical, barely spoke to him. Gabriel was less distant, but still kept his emotions hidden behind a wall of deflective humor. Lucas, the youngest, had shown a willingness to open up, but there were times when even he seemed to pull away, unsure of what to make of Jonathan's presence. Jonathan knew that this wasn't going to be fixed with a few good conversations or gestures of remorse. He had tried to fill the void in his life with success and material wealth, and now he was realizing that the only thing that mattered was time. The time he had lost with them. The time he couldn't get back. Elin had been patient, but her silence was just as heavy as the boy's resistance. She never interfered, never tried to push Jonathan, but her eyes told him everything. She was watching him, waiting to see if he would truly stick around this time. She had lived through the pain of raising their children alone, had endured years of hardship without him, and Jonathan knew she wouldn't allow herself to hope for anything more unless he proved he deserved it. One evening, after a long day of strained attempts to connect with the boys, Jonathan found himself sitting in the living room again, staring at the framed photo of his children that Elin had given him. He had kept it on the mantle, a constant reminder of what he had missed. The picture was so simple, so ordinary, and yet to Jonathan, it was everything. It was proof that he had been absent for too long and that he would never be able to erase the mistakes of his past. Why didn't you ever tell them? Jonathan whispered to himself, his voice breaking in the quiet of the room. Why didn't you tell them about me? He had asked Elin that question before, but hearing it again, even in his own mind, felt like a weight he could barely lift. Why had she kept the truth from them? Why had she protected him, the man who had abandoned them, from the reality of his own actions? The answer was simple, yet it cut through him like a blade. She had done it because she had never wanted them to feel abandoned. She had never wanted them to believe that Jonathan's absence was their fault. She had kept the truth hidden because, in some way, she had hoped that Jonathan would come back, that he would return and prove himself. And now, Jonathan knew he was living the consequence of her silence. He had to earn their trust, not just with words, but with actions. He had no illusions. He wasn't going to win them over in one night, 1 week, or even 1 month. The road ahead would be long, and the pain would not fade overnight. But for the first time, Jonathan understood that the only thing he could do now was show up. Every day, no matter how small the step, no matter how many times they pushed him away, he had to keep trying. That night, as he sat there in the silence, Elin walked into the room. She stopped in the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You're still here," she said quietly. Jonathan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He had no answers, no excuses, just the quiet weight of his promise. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. Elin's eyes softened for a moment, but her expression remained unreadable. "I hope you mean that." "I do," Jonathan replied. "I know it's not enough, but I'll prove it to them. I'll prove it to you. Every day." Elin said nothing, but she didn't leave. Instead, she sat down beside him. For the first time since they had reconnected, there was a kind of stillness between them. A peace, though it was fragile. She didn't have to say anything. She knew that his words were sincere. But she also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. "Show them, Jonathan," she said softly. "That's all you can do now." Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had to prove himself, not just to her, but to the boys. He had to show them that he could be the father they needed, the father they deserved. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but for the first time, Jonathan knew he couldn't turn back. The next day, he decided to take a step, however small it seemed. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had to start somewhere. He had to show them that he was willing to make the effort. He found Gabriel sitting alone in the kitchen, his usual sarcasm replaced by a quiet uncertainty. "Hey," Jonathan said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Can we talk?" Gabriel looked up at him, his eyes wary, but he didn't say anything. Jonathan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation he knew wasn't going to be easy. "I know I've been absent," Jonathan began, his voice low but steady. "And I know you have every right to be angry with me. I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want to be here for you. All of you." Gabriel didn't respond immediately, but Jonathan saw the flicker of something in his eyes. A spark, maybe, a glimmer of hope. It was a small thing, but to Jonathan it was everything. "I'm here," Jonathan said softly, "and I'll keep showing up, no matter what." For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. Gabriel looked at him, then nodded slowly, though he still didn't say anything. But that was enough. It was a start. As Jonathan walked away, he felt the tiniest bit of relief. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a crack in the wall, and for now, that was enough. The days blurred into weeks, and Jonathan's hope, though steady, felt fragile at times. He continued to show up every day, trying to earn the trust he had lost. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this process was. Each small step he took forward seemed to be met with another wall, another barrier that his sons had built in response to his absence. And yet, Jonathan kept trying. Raphael remained distant. His words were few and often sharp, like a knife carefully hidden in plain sight. Gabriel had become less defensive, but still, there was an unspoken tension in every interaction. Only Lucas, the youngest, seemed to give Jonathan even the slightest bit of hope. The quiet conversations they shared, though brief, were more than Jonathan had ever dared hope for. Still, nothing came easily, but he wasn't giving up. No matter how many times they pushed him away, he was there. And little by little, he could feel something shift. It was subtle, like the faintest crack in a wall that had stood for years. But it was something. One evening, Jonathan found himself alone in the living room again, the television off, the house quiet. He was trying to prepare himself for another conversation, another attempt to break through the walls his sons had built. But there was a weight to this silence, a weight he hadn't fully understood until now. Elin walked into the room, her movements as graceful and deliberate as ever. She had been quieter lately, too, her patience starting to wear thin. She had given him space, allowed him to take the lead in his attempts at reconciliation. But Jonathan knew that now, more than ever, she was watching him, watching for any sign that he was truly committed to this, truly committed to them. "You've been doing a lot," she said, breaking the silence. "But they're still not there yet. They're still distant. And I can see it in your eyes. You're starting to feel it, aren't you?" Jonathan's gaze dropped to the floor. The weight of her words hit him hard. He had been trying so hard every day to prove to them that he was here, that he cared, but it felt like nothing was enough. "I don't know if I'm doing it right," Jonathan said, his voice hoarse. "I feel like I'm losing them all over again, and I don't know how to fix it." Elin sat beside him, her presence steady, comforting. She didn't try to offer quick fixes or empty reassurances. She understood the depth of what Jonathan was going through because, in many ways, she had been there too. She had raised their children on her own, had loved them fiercely, even when she was exhausted, even when she had nothing left to give. "You're doing it right because you're here," she said quietly. "That's all you can do. You're showing up. But you can't rush it, Jonathan. Trust is built, not forced. You've got to be patient." Jonathan nodded, swallowing hard. Patience. It was something he had never been good at. He had always been driven by results, by seeing tangible outcomes from his efforts. But this was different. This wasn't about money or success or influence. This was about earning the trust of 3 young men who had every right to resent him. This was about building something from nothing, and it would take time. "I know," Jonathan said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "But I don't know if I can wait that long. I don't know if they'll ever forgive me." Elin looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You can't make them forgive you, Jonathan. But you can be here. That's all you can control. And right now, that's what matters." Jonathan exhaled, his chest tight. She was right, of course. He couldn't force forgiveness, couldn't force his children to accept him on his terms. But he could show up day after day, even when it was hard, even when they rejected him. That was something he could control. He was still there. He was still trying, and that at least was enough. The weeks continued to drag on, and Jonathan's patience, though tested, remained firm. He had stopped expecting quick fixes, stopped thinking that one heartfelt conversation would make everything right. He had learned the hard way that trust, once broken, wasn't something that could be restored in a moment. It took time. It took persistence. It took showing up day after day, even when it felt like nothing was changing. Raphael remained cold, his words clipped, his demeanor distant. Gabriel, ever the realist, still held on to his cynicism, but there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when Jonathan saw something in his eyes. Something like curiosity, like the faintest glimmer of hope. Lucas was the one Jonathan had the most connection with, and their conversations, though still tentative, were becoming more frequent, more open. One evening, Jonathan found himself sitting alone in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window. The house was quieter than usual. Elin had gone out for a while, and the boys had retreated to their rooms. It had been a long day, and though he hadn't expected any breakthroughs, he couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. He had been here for weeks now, trying to make amends, but it felt like he was still a stranger to them. Just as he was about to finish his coffee, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Lucas entered the kitchen, hesitating for a moment at the doorway. Jonathan set his mug down, his heart pounding a little faster. "Hey," Jonathan said softly, trying not to let his surprise show. "What's going on?" Lucas didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. Jonathan waited, giving him the space to speak, to say whatever was on his mind. Finally, Lucas looked up, his expression unreadable. "I don't get it," he said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't understand why you're doing this. Why now? Why do you want to be part of our lives now? After everything?" Jonathan felt the weight of the question, the same one he had asked himself over and over. He had spent so many years buried in his work, in his success, that he hadn't seen the consequences of his absence. But now, facing Lucas, he realized the truth of it. There was no easy answer, no quick fix. "I know it doesn't make sense," Jonathan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't expect you to understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm here. I'm here because I want to be. I want to be a part of your life, Lucas. I want to try." Lucas looked at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Jonathan's face, as though trying to determine if his words were genuine. For a second, the silence felt unbearable. Jonathan held his breath, waiting for the response that could either tear down the fragile bridge he was building or shatter it completely. Then, Lucas spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted, his words laced with doubt. "But I guess I can give you a chance." Jonathan's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He didn't expect Lucas to forgive him on the spot. But this small opening, this willingness to try, was something he hadn't dared hope for. It was a sign, however small, that the years of absence weren't irreparable. He had been given a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. "Thank you," Jonathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I don't deserve it, but I promise I'll do everything I can to prove to you that I'm here for good." Lucas nodded, his face still guarded, but with a faint trace of something softer in his eyes. "I'll hold you to that," he said before turning and walking out of the kitchen. Jonathan sat there for a long time, his thoughts racing. A small part of him had hoped for this. Hoped that, with enough time and effort, Lucas might open up. But now that it had happened, the weight of it was overwhelming. This was just the beginning. There was so much more to do, so much more to prove. And yet, for the first time in months, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed Lucas's hesitant admission felt like the slow, steady turning of a page. For the first time since Jonathan had returned, he sensed a shift, not an overwhelming change, but a small, quiet breakthrough. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning, a crack in the fortress of resentment and silence that had stood between him and his children for so long. Jonathan continued to show up without fanfare or expectation. There were still moments of coldness, of indifference, especially from Raphael, who had yet to show any sign of softening. Gabriel, while less defensive, still kept his distance, his words often edged with skepticism. But Lucas had given him a chance, and though it wasn't much, it was enough to keep Jonathan going. He had learned, painfully, that the road to redemption wasn't paved with grand gestures. It was made up of quiet moments, shared glances, brief conversations, the willingness to just be present, even when it seemed like nothing was changing. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jonathan found himself sitting in the backyard, staring at the darkening sky. His mind wandered back to that first night at the restaurant, when everything had seemed so impossible. He had walked in that night, not knowing the truth, not understanding the gravity of the situation. But now, as he sat there, he realized how far he had come, even if it was just a small step forward. The door creaked open, and he turned to see Elin walking toward him. She had been quieter lately, but there was a sense of calm about her now, a quiet confidence in her presence. Jonathan hadn't asked her for any validation, hadn't expected any approval. But in the moments when she had quietly watched him with their sons, he had begun to sense that, perhaps, she was starting to see the man he was trying to be. "You're still here," Elin said, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple statement, as if she were making sure of something she had already known. "I'm not going anywhere," Jonathan replied softly, his voice steady. "I can't undo what I've done, but I'm here now, and I will be, every day." Elin sat down beside him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of understanding and cautious hope. She had watched him, observed his efforts, and had given him space to prove himself. There was no rush, no pressure, but she had seen the changes in him, subtle but real. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said quietly. "I don't need your apologies. I don't need anything from you, Jonathan. What matters now is what you do for them." She paused for a moment, her gaze shifting to the house, where their sons were inside, living lives that had long been shaped without him. "For them, not for me. That's where the real work lies." Jonathan nodded, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He understood now, perhaps more clearly than ever, that this wasn't about winning back Elon's trust or even his own peace of mind. This was about his children, their forgiveness, their trust, and their future. He was here now, and he would be for as long as it took. As they sat there in silence, watching the sky darken, Jonathan couldn't help but think about the long road ahead. There were no promises, no guarantees. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. His sons were still distant, still guarded, but they were slowly beginning to let him in. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and sometimes that was all you could ask for. Later that evening, after dinner, Jonathan found himself sitting at the kitchen table, lost in thought. Raphael came in, his expression unreadable, but for the first time, there was no hostility, no coldness. He simply sat down across from Jonathan, staring at him for a long moment. "I don't know what you expect from us," Raphael said quietly, his voice rough. "But I'll say this. If you're serious about being here, if you really want to be our father, you need to show us. Not with words, but with your actions. We've been on our own for a long time." Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of Raphael's words. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm not going to ask for forgiveness right away. But I'm here, and I'll keep showing up. Every day." Raphael didn't answer, but for the first time, Jonathan thought he saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something like understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was enough to keep Jonathan going. The days ahead were uncertain. There were still many hurdles to cross, still much work to be done. But Jonathan knew one thing. He wasn't walking away again. He was here, and he was going to stay. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead, but he was determined to see it through. As the night wore on, Jonathan sat with Elon in the quiet of the house, both of them knowing that the journey was far from over. But it was a journey they would take together, one step at a time. Sometimes the hardest part isn't fixing the past, it's showing up in the present. Jonathan's journey reminds us that real change starts with the courage to stay, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. We may not be able to undo our mistakes, but every small effort counts. Every moment of showing up matters. Don't wait for the perfect time to start mending what's broken. Start now. Did Jonathan's story resonate with you? We all have moments we wish we could rewrite, but it's never too late to start making things right. Share your thoughts below, like this video if it inspired you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and ignite change. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply show up, and the journey starts with one click.